Hello there. Today, I'd like to take you on an ASMR adventure into another of England's dazzlingly grand stately homes, Burley House. Burley is located in Lincolnshire, on the eastern side of Britain, and the house was built for William Cecil, who was the Lord High Treasurer to Queen Elizabeth I. The Cecils became an incredibly wealthy and powerful family, and William's son became the first Earl of Exeter. The house remained in the ownership of the Earls of Exeter and their descendants right up until the 1960s, when it was then passed to a charitable trust that had been set up by the Cecil family to protect Burley for future generations. Today, this extraordinary house is open to visitors, and so in this talk, I'm going to guide you around Burley. I'll lead you through the many rooms that are on display, and I'll describe to you one or two of the key features that can be seen in every chamber. As usual, there'll be some photographs to accompany our tour, if you'd like to actually look at the rooms that I'm describing. And once again, these photos have been kindly provided by Simon Wilkinson, whose lovely photography work you'll have seen before, if you've watched my Chatsworth House video. I'm going to put a link to his portfolio on Flickr in the description below the video, so that you can check out more of his work for yourself. However, there's no need for you to look at the photographs right now if you don't want to. You can always revisit them later on at another time, so that right now you can just close your eyes, relax, and let my voice guide you. So, welcome to Burley House. Before we enter the building, let's take a moment to stand outside and admire this magnificent structure. It was completed in 1587, and like Hatfield House, which we've also visited together in a previous video, Burley is a prime example of an Elizabethan prodigy house, which is to say it was built in the grandest style, with plenty of swagger, specifically to inspire awe and to provide suitably magnificent accommodation for any potential monarchs who might wish to pay a visit. So Burley began as a grand Elizabethan palace, but it was extensively remodelled in the 17th century, and that means that as we explore the house, we'll find that most of the rooms are decorated in a later Baroque style, and there aren't many original Elizabethan interiors left to see. However, one exception to this can be seen in the very first room we'll visit when we enter the house, and that's the old kitchen. This room does retain its original Elizabethan features. It's a lofty and light-filled room with bare limestone walls and a beautiful fan-vaulted ceiling. The actual kitchen equipment is much later. It dates from the 19th century because the kitchens were updated during the Victorian era, which the cooks must have been very pleased about. And the room now contains several 19th century black-leaded ranges and ovens. There's also a gleaming copper batterie de cuisine on display that contains 260 pieces of kitchen equipment, including jugs, kettles, saucepans of all shapes and sizes, and, rather interestingly, a copper soup tureen in the shape of a turtle. This piece was specifically made for holding turtle soup, which was considered to be a great delicacy in the 19th century. And, rather sadly, on the arching vault above the tureen, there are 14 turtle skulls mounted on the wall, who were obviously unlucky enough to be brought to Burley House and met their fate in this very kitchen. Beneath these skulls on the same wall, there's also a rather amusing painted sign that reads, "It is expressly ordered by his lordship that no servants shall enter the kitchen except on business, or remain longer than is necessary to perform what they have to do." This rather stern announcement indicates another feature of every large country house kitchen. As well as being the place where food was prepared and sumptuous banquets were cooked, the kitchen was also a hub of social activity. It was warm, it was dry, it was full of good things to eat, and so kitchens were naturally a place where many of the servants would be tempted to linger and gossip and socialise. Rather than lingering ourselves, let's leave the kitchen now and walk through a hallway lined with servants' bells and fire buckets. We'll then walk up the Roman staircase, which is another example of the original Tudor interior scheme at Burley, and also has a magnificently vaulted limestone ceiling. At the top of the stairs, we'll find ourselves on the first floor of the house, where the state apartments are situated. But before we begin to walk through them, let's just take a quick peep inside the Cecil family chapel to look at the altarpiece which is hanging there, and which was painted by the Italian 16th century master Veronese. This notable painting was acquired by Brownlow Cecil, who was the 9th Earl of Exeter during the 18th century, and it's one of just many artworks that we'll see as we walk around Burley, which is famous for its collection. Several generations of the Cecil family added to it, and consequently nearly every room that we'll visit has walls that are thronged with gilt-framed oil paintings. Let's begin our tour of the main rooms on the first floor now, and start with the billiard room, where in fact we'll see the first example of walls that are lined with paintings. Most of the art in this room is made up of family portraits of the Cecils, but there's also a selection of canvases that represent the members of the Order of Little Bedlam. The Order of Little Bedlam was a drinking club which was founded by John Cecil, the 5th Earl of Exeter, and its members were mainly aristocratic young gentlemen who were fond of a drink, fond of carousing, and, as might be inferred from the name of the club, were fond of creating bedlam. However, although most of the club members were young lords or aristocrats, the 5th Earl did also have quite a few artists in his retinue of friends. He was a well-travelled and enthusiastic patron of the arts, and so one of the portraits in the billiard room depicts the Italian muralist Antonio Verrio. As we explore Burley House, we'll discover some breathtaking interiors that were painted by Verrio and commissioned by his friend, the 5th Earl. But for now, let's remain in the billiard room and turn our attention to the billiard table itself. This stands at the centre of the room covered as most billiard tables are by green baize, and it was made by John Thurston, a London cabinet maker who became known as the father of the modern billiard table because he invented the slate beds and rubber cushions that are still used in the game today. This table is one of his earliest billiard designs, and Thurston fashioned it from the salvaged oak timbers of a ship, HMS Royal George, which was a 100-gun ship of the line and the largest warship in the world when it was launched in 1756. However, it rather ignobly sank in 1782 whilst it was docked at Spithead, undergoing routine maintenance work, and so the timber was salvaged, and some of it ended up here, in this billiard table. The billiard room is a relatively cosy and comfortable space by the otherwise rather monumental standards of Burley House in general. However, the next room we'll walk into is far more formal and dramatic. This is the Bow Room, a sumptuous and splendid chamber which has walls and ceiling covered in paintings by the muralist Louis Laguerre. And if you've listened to my previous tour of Chatsworth House, you might remember the name Louis Laguerre because he was responsible for decorating the grand painted hall there. Laguerre was celebrated for his opulent and glowing room schemes, and the Burley Bow Room is a prime example of that. It features luminous depictions of scenes from Roman history, and they're all painted in warm and vivid colours. Laguerre was known for his trompe-l'oeil effects, that is to say, optical illusions, which he painted on the walls to create tricks of the eye. And there are several examples of these illusions in this room. Most of the classical scenes are surrounded by gilded frames, which at first glance may be taken for real picture frames, but of course they're actually just painted effects. There's also a particularly charming illusion in each of the four corners of the room, which are graced with pairs of flying cherubs or putti, and they're holding aloft elaborate looking glasses which appear to reflect the room, although of course they are just painted on the wall. Laguerre completed the Bow Room in 1697, and in the following century it was used quite regularly for grand balls and musical evenings. And it's such an atmospheric and vivid room that I think it must have made a rather wonderful and enchanting setting for such evenings, especially when it was lit up with the flickering glow from hundreds of candles. Let's walk on now through a door that will take us into the brown drawing room. This room feels relatively modest in relation to its opulent neighbour, but it's still far grander than the average room, and it has walls lined with wood panelling and gold damask, and a plaster ceiling that is elaborately carved with swags of fruit and flowers. However, perhaps unexpectedly for a drawing room, there's a small single bed situated between the two tall windows. This is fitted with a brass canopy and draped with deep pink moire silk, and it was added to the room in 1835 so that a young princess could sleep in this room overnight while she visited Burley. That princess was the niece of the then monarch, William IV, and 2 years after her visit to Burley, she would succeed to the British throne as Queen Victoria. so consequently the bed that she slept in while she was here as a young princess has remained here ever since. The final room we'll visit on the north side of the house is the black and yellow bedroom, which I have to say is my favourite room at Burley. It was refurbished for the 9th Earl of Exeter in the 1770s by the firm of Ince and Mayhew. Ince and Mayhew were a pair of furniture makers, upholsterers and decorators who were extremely fashionable in the second half of the 18th century. For this room they created a vibrant yet very elegant black and yellow scheme, the focal point of which is a wonderful mahogany state bed that's hung with exquisite chinoiserie curtains. They're covered in crewel work, which is a type of woolen embroidery in a gorgeous pattern of multicoloured flowers and foliage. And there's a matching canopy surrounding the top of the bed frame too, and matching curtains at the windows. However, if you peep past the bed hangings, you'll find that the bed's interior is also gorgeously upholstered. It's covered in a rich yellow satin and crowned with a shaped headboard that features sumptuous needlework, as well as an embroidered letter E, which was added in honour of the Cecil family's connection with Elizabeth I. I must say, I could quite happily curl up on that priceless four-poster bed with a good book and while away many hours in this lovely, atmospheric room. However, as that sadly isn't an option, let's continue on our tour and turn left into the western range of the house. The first room we'll enter is the Marquetry Room, which has walls hung with dark green damask and features an interesting corner fireplace topped with a chimney tree. If you haven't come across a chimney tree before, it's sort of a pyramid-shaped set of shelves that were often mounted above corner fireplaces specifically for displaying china. This particular tree was created to house a selection of delicate and precious Japanese porcelain, which still graces the room today. However, as might be inferred from the name of the room, the Marquetry Room is also the home of several beautiful pieces of marquetry furniture. Marquetry is a decoration technique that involves cutting and carving tiny slivers of different types and colours of wood, which are then applied to the surface of a piece of furniture to make up beautiful patterns. Examples of marquetry furniture on display in this room include a tall 18th century Dutch cabinet, which is decorated with an elaborate floral design, and an Anglo-Dutch chest of drawers, which is adorned with birds and flowers on a dark wood background. Walking on, we can step through into Queen Elizabeth's bedroom, which is a rather misleading name because Elizabeth never actually slept here. In the Elizabethan era, this room was, in fact, part of a much longer gallery, which was then divided up into smaller apartments in the 17th century. Nevertheless, today it's the home of an imposing mahogany state bed, which is topped with a moulded cornice covered in gold-embroidered silk. Beneath this, the bed itself is decorated in a gorgeous scheme of sea green velvet, trimmed with golden braids and brocades. The ruched interior of the bed also features a beautiful scheme of cherubs, leaves and flowers, while the headboard is topped with a finely carved giltwood cresting. There are also several comfortable-looking armchairs in this room, which are decorated in the same sea green and gold colour scheme, while the walls behind the bed are hung with Gobelin tapestries, depicting scenes from Ovid's Metamorphoses. It's another beautiful bedroom, and I particularly love that subtle shade of sea green that's been used on the upholstery. However, there are still many rooms to visit, so let's continue now and wander through to the pagoda room. This room is named after a pair of exquisite little models of miniature pagodas that are made from mother of pearl and have tiny roofs decorated with rows of miniature gold bells. The room is also notable for its many portraits, most of which show members of the Cecil family, and there's a particularly impressive painting of William Cecil, who was Elizabeth's Lord High Treasurer. There's also a portrait of Elizabeth I herself by the Dutch artist Marcus Heeraerts the Younger, and this shows her as an older woman wearing a fabulous white jewelled dress and an elaborate Elizabethan ruff. Walking on into the blue silk bedroom, we'll find another splendid state bed by Ince and Mayhew. This one features intricately carved bedposts, which are decorated with acanthus leaves, and the bed also features beautiful blue silk and velvet hangings, and a red velvet cornice. There's a sumptuously embroidered crewelwork counterpane on top of the bed, and a matching upholstered headboard topped with intricate gold carving. I'd also like to draw your attention to a very finely decorated collector's cabinet, which stands to one side of the bed, and which was made by Pierre Gaulle, a furniture maker for Louis XIV of France. The story goes that this particular cabinet was actually made for the king in 1680, but it was rejected by him, and so subsequently was sold instead to the 5th Earl of Exeter, who, you'll remember, was the founder of the Bedlam Club. As well as being an enthusiastic drinker, he had an eye for art and artifacts, and along with his wife, Lady Anne Cavendish, he was one of the first grand tourists. Those super wealthy and fashionable young aristocrats who travelled about mainland Europe buying up as many great artworks as possible. The 5th Earl acquired more than 300 pieces in this way. However, his greatest achievement at Burley is still yet to be discovered. So let's continue through the blue silk dressing room, where we can pause for a moment to admire a lovely collection of blue and white oriental porcelain, and make our way into the first George room, where we can pick up the story of the 5th Earl. This chamber is the first and smallest room in a suite of 5 state apartments that are all decorated by the painter Antonio Verrio. The 5th Earl commissioned Verrio, who, as we've already learned, was one of his drinking buddies, to create a series of elaborate ceiling murals for these staterooms, and all of them show various characters from classical mythology disporting themselves in a succession of increasingly exuberant and jaw-dropping tableaux. In this first George room, we find a scene of Phoebus, the god of day, who is chasing away Morpheus, the god of night. Phoebus was the Roman incarnation of the Greek sun god Apollo, and Verrio has depicted him as a golden-haired youth, riding a golden chariot with golden sunbeams radiating from his head. By contrast, Morpheus is painted in shades of grey. He's an old grey-haired man with a grey beard who is reclining on a grey-coloured but star-spangled coverlet with the goddess Luna at his side. And I must say he looks pretty irritated to have been interrupted by Phoebus with his company of gilded youths and cherubs. There's also a tiny closet in the southwest corner of this room, which also contains a separate Verrio ceiling mural, probably the smallest one he ever painted, I would imagine. And this portrays a scene of Fortune tied to her own wheel. On the opposite wall to the closet, a richly panelled door leads through to the second George room, which is almost a perfectly square chamber and has a Verrio ceiling that depicts the god of war, Mars, with Romulus and Jupiter. Romulus, you may remember from your school days, was one of the twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, who were said to have founded Rome. One of the many myths surrounding him states that Romulus's father was Mars, and that Mars persuaded Jupiter, the king of the gods, to turn his son into an immortal. And that appears to be the conversation that Mars and Jupiter are having in this Verrio ceiling painting. Beneath these chatting gods lies another sumptuous state bed, which was made in 1795 by the firm of Fell and Newton. It's another bed that was slept in by Queen Victoria, because she came back for another visit to Burley in 1844, this time accompanied by her husband, Prince Albert. The bed features an opulent gilded frame, carved with swags of flowers and birds, and it has crimson bed hangings, with matching upholstered head and footboards. There's also a gilded royal coat of arms that was added in honour of Victoria's visit. Stepping through now into the third George room, we'll find ourselves in an elegant drawing room with handsome red damask wall hangings and a suite of beautifully embroidered giltwood salon furniture. Once again, there's an exuberant ceiling painting by Verrio, this time depicting the marriage of Cupid and Psyche. As I'm sure you already know, these star-crossed lovers of Roman mythology were forced to part after Psyche disobeyed the orders of the gods and deigned to take a peek at her celestial husband. It does seem reasonable to want to know what your husband looks like. But anyway, the gods weren't very happy about this. So Psyche was banished. But after a series of trials and quests, she was finally reunited with Cupid, and it's this joyful reunion that Verrio has chosen to paint. However, rather oddly, the couple themselves are off to one side of the ceiling, and it's actually the figure of the goddess Flora who takes centre stage, with her blue silk robe and her spring-like wreath of pink roses. Let's go on now into the fourth George room, where we'll find a further assortment of classical deities frolicking on the ceiling. This time they feature in a tableau known as the Feast of the Gods, which is a fitting subject matter because when Queen Victoria stayed in these apartments during her 1844 visit, the fourth George room was used as her dining room. At the centre of the ceiling we see the King and Queen of the Gods, Jupiter and Juno, and they're sitting at the head of a long cloth-covered table, while above them a succession of gods and nymphs are fetching enormous platters piled high with food. Beneath the table of the gods, at the bottom of the scene, there's also a depiction of the goddess Plenty, who is surrounded by a cornucopia of loaves, fishes, and fowl. However, there's more to this figure of Plenty than meets the eye, because according to anecdote, Verrio based the likeness of the goddess on one of the Burley servants, who was called Goody Rudkin. Depending on who you talk to, you'll find different stories that account for how Goody Rudkin ended up on this ceiling. One version of events relates that Verrio, who was known for his womanizing, made a pass at Goody and was repulsed by her. Another variation suggests that Verrio, who was equally known for his drinking, fell out with Goody Rudkin because she was in charge of the Burghley Brew House, and she refused to give him an additional allowance of ale. Either way, Verrio took his revenge by including Goody's likeness in his Feast of the Gods tableau, and if this story seems vaguely familiar to you, it's probably because you've listened to my talk on Chatsworth House. Verrio also painted a ceiling there, which was also covered with gods and goddesses, and he also fell out with one of the servants at Chatsworth and took revenge by painting her into the ceiling. It seems to be a thing that he did when he was feeling spiteful. At Chatsworth, the artist's ire fell upon the housekeeper, Mrs. Hackett, and he depicted her as the Greek fate Atropos, dressed in a ghostly grey robe. However, at Burley, Goody Rudkin came in for a far more humiliating punishment, because as the goddess Plenty, not only is she depicted naked, but also Verrio has chosen to give her 3 pairs of breasts. Mrs. Hackett got off quite lightly by comparison, although I must say I think possibly Goody had the last laugh, because although she was probably very embarrassed by her inclusion in the ceiling at the time, these days I think she just looks rather magnificent as the goddess Plenty. Anyway, let's bid adieu to Goody and walk on into the last and the grandest of Verrio's state apartments for Burley, the Heaven Room. My goodness, this room is just incredibly extravagant. It's hard to put into words, really, just how over the top it is. Verrio has chosen in this scheme not just to paint the ceiling, but also the walls as well. And he's created a sort of trompe-l'oeil effect by turning the whole of the room into the illusion of a classical temple, complete with Corinthian columns and festoons of flowers. In, around, and above the temple, we can see various scenes of classical mythology being played out. There's Neptune, the god of the sea, Bacchus, the god of wine, Mercury, the messenger of the gods, and Venus and Mars, who are the guilty lovers caught in a net. Meanwhile, in one corner, Venus's husband Vulcan hammers away in his forge, and he's surrounded by some rather interesting figures. If you look closely, you'll notice that several of the characters who surround Vulcan have an extra third eye in their foreheads, and this is because they are meant to be cyclopses. However, sitting just behind the forge, there's also a distinctly mortal-looking gentleman with a bald head who's reclining on the temple steps, surveying the scene before him. And this is said to be a self-portrait of Antonio Verrio, who painted himself into the Heaven Room as a lasting testament, I suppose, to his own genius. On the ceiling above the temple, the king and queen of the gods, Jupiter and Juno, are back with us, and they're holding court over the entire pantheon of gods in a sunlight-filled, rainbow-crested sky. The gods are all romping about on banks of clouds and looking rather resplendent, because the colours that Verrio has used are incredibly vibrant. All of his ceilings at Burley are, but this one in particular is just very vivid and very bright. There's hardly any furniture in the heaven room, because there simply isn't any need for it. The room itself is busy enough just with all the figures who are crowded into it on the walls and ceiling. Even if you're standing in here completely on your own, you still feel that you're surrounded by people, because you are. There are gods and goddesses coming at you from every angle, standing, sitting, flying, twisting, cavorting. And it really is quite an extraordinary experience to be surrounded by all this spectacular and lavish opulence. Also, if any of those cavorting naked bodies look vaguely familiar to you, it might be because you've seen them before, on screen. Burley has been used as a film location at various times over the years. Scenes from the Da Vinci Code film that starred Tom Hanks were filmed here, and Jane Austen fans will recognise the Heaven Room from its transformation into Lady Catherine de Bourgh's drawing room at Rosings Park in the 2005 adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. The Heaven Room is 39 feet long, 27 feet wide, and 24 feet high, and it took Verrio 75 weeks to finish the decoration in here. It's considered to be his masterpiece, a Baroque fantasy that overpowers the senses and overwhelms the mind. However, it wasn't the final work that Verrio left behind at Burley. To see that, we need to walk through the next wood-panelled door and explore the Hell Staircase. Walking onto this staircase is, again, an extraordinary experience. It's as though, having finished these state apartments, Verrio wanted to flabbergast his viewers with one final flourish, and that flourish takes the form of a vast ceiling painting, which crowns an enormous double-height staircase. As you walk down the stairs, it really does feel as though you're descending into hell, thanks to the dark colours that Verrio has used, and the, frankly bonkers scene he's painted. The focus of the work is the huge open mouth of an enormous hell beast. It's apparently meant to be a giant cat, although it doesn't look particularly cat-like. And this beast's mouth is full of fire, and spilling out of it are legions of demons and unfortunate souls who are tumbling down out of their fiery torments. Further up the ceiling, there's also the skeletal figure of the Grim Reaper with his enormous scythe, and all around him there's a profusion of bodies writhing and contorting in pain and anguish as they suffer all the various punishments of hell. This is another frantically busy scheme with lots of movement and lots of twisting naked bodies. However, it strikes an entirely different tone to the Heaven Room, just because of its dark subject matter and glowering colours. The gloom has been further exacerbated by the addition of later wall paintings by the artist Thomas Stothard, and the whole experience of standing on this staircase is both striking and unnerving. It is without doubt a breathtaking and impressive decorative scheme, But I can't help feeling rather sorry for the former inmates of Burley, who perhaps had to walk down this staircase the morning after a particularly heavy night, because just the ceiling alone would be enough to give one a hangover, I think. As we walk down the staircase ourselves, we leave the frenzied imaginings of Verrio behind us and step into an elegant and mercifully calm limestone stairwell, which is decorated with graceful classical columns and ornamented with antiquarian statues. From here, we'll walk through into the Great Hall, an enormous chamber which measures 60 feet in length and 30 feet in width. It features an impressive double-height hammer-beam ceiling with matching oak wall panelling and 2 enormous windows fitted with stained glass. Nevertheless, in spite of its size, this hall feels almost modest and austere in its decoration, in comparison to the elaborate and florid illusions of Verrio that we've just witnessed upstairs. Whether this contrast comes as a disappointment or a welcome relief depends largely, I suppose, on how you feel about Verrio's work. But either way, the Great Hall is still a magnificent room, and it's the place where, every year, the 300-plus Burley staff and estate workers still gather for their annual Christmas celebrations. The Great Hall is also the last room we'll visit on our tour of the house. But there's still much left to see at Burley, including the visitor centre in the former brew house, the temporary exhibition rooms, and the lovely grounds and gardens. There's a beautiful deer park, which was landscaped by the famous garden architect Capability Brown in the 18th century, and which features beautiful, soft, rolling green hills, magnificent oak trees, and a tranquil lake. There are also the rather delightful Gardens of Surprise to explore, and these are a relatively new feature at Burley, because they only opened in 2013. They were inspired by the traditional garden layouts of the Tudor era, but they combine features from that time with more contemporary aspects of garden design. So as you walk through them, you'll find Tudor-style geometrical knot gardens and box hedges, but you'll also discover an array of contemporary sculpture and a rather tricksy water maze. Burley really is a fabulous place to spend a day. It's a great house in the truest sense of the word, full of historic and artistic wonders, and well worth paying a visit to if you ever find yourself in that eastern part of England. So that brings us to the end of our tour of Burley, and I do hope you've enjoyed exploring its remarkable rooms with me. I hope too that you can join me again soon for another ASMR adventure. Until then, thank you for your company. Goodbye.